So thanks for coming to the Seattle Angel Conference Workshop Series. We run these every Thursday year round, and we will pick up a second group of them on Tuesday evening starting in June. We use them as part of our process for the Seattle Angel Conference. And as Elizabeth was saying, our 19th Seattle Angel Conference is coming up next Wednesday at 3 o'clock, where we will have our 6 finalists present and then go in the back room and pick which one will get the investment, and we'll write a $200,000 investment into one of those companies. We've done this 18 times now, and we are in 35 companies as a whole. But more importantly, we have over 450 new angel investors who are now writing regular checks and have produced things like Grub Stakes and Sea Change Fund and Flying Fish Ventures and First Fill Partners. So we are starting to explore the question of a angel conference to produce new angels that are focused on health and wellness. That's we're calling the APIS Health Angels Network. Bob is going to be the LLC organizer for that. Elizabeth is the program manager for that. And we're starting to sneak health-oriented workshops into the Seattle Angel program with the intent of producing weekly health-oriented ones in September, trying to build out the capacity of our ecosystem to write more pre-seed health and wellness kinds of angel checks into the community. And so before we get going with our speaker, Julie, I would like to have Julie understand who's here. So let's go around the room and do little quick introductions, and then we'll jump into the talking. So Bob, could you go first?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a part-time physician. Been working with John or participating with SAC for the past 5 or so years, helping with the APIS Health Angels, like you mentioned. Also working on a startup that's leveraging technology to highly make checking process at doctor's clinic more efficient.
Thank you. Other Bob.
Hi, I'm Bob Davidson, recently retired from Microsoft a little over a year ago. Went through Angels 17 and we did the investment there. I've been investing in the market for 20 years now, I guess. But this is the first really angel doing it all myself process. So it was fun and interesting. Again, with a COVID last year and retiring, it's been a hectic year, but I'm hoping to continue to play in the investments locally here too.
Cool, thank you. Deborah, how about you?
Good. I'm the CEO of Body Guide. We have an anklet that measures peripheral edema, so we're definitely in the health and wellness space. There's many uses, but our first indication is heart failure. Heart failure patients need a way to monitor their fluid retention as a sign of how they're doing. And so we have a technology platform, and we're looking how to bridge that into the market. Technology is not enough. You got to know how to have a business around it. So that's our primary focus right now, is how we make a business out of our technology.
Thank you. Sarah, how about you?
I'm Sarah Gallo. I'm actually in Denver, but I'm part of Cambia Grove, and I just came to listen in. I was a primary care provider, and now I am doing product and also an entrepreneur in telemedicine and specifically in the safety net population.
Cool, thank you so much. Alicia, how about you?
Hi, everybody. Well, my background is in healthcare. Sorry, I don't have video today. My husband is having some conference calls with Israel, so I can't mess that up. I have actually been connected to Cambia Grove since pretty much the beginning. And we have a group that is the Seattle Health Innovators in Healthcare, which we haven't been able to really follow through up since the pandemic started. Hopefully we'll start it all over again. But one of the things that I have been doing is, volunteering, pretty much helping people that are in tech and other industries help. Yeah, I've been helping them understand the healthcare system and how it works. Even though there are a lot of people that come up with really good ideas and actually concepts that would work, they don't take into consideration some things like policy, or is it a win-win for a physician? Might not be a win-win situation for a patient. It might not work because of those reasons. So they need to work on those things. And so people reach out to me pretty much to talk about and discuss what would work and what would not. So pretty much, following with Cambia, we had actually a yearly competition of startups in healthcare, and we would get together and review these companies, and we would choose a winner every December. Hopefully for this year, I'm not sure that it's going to happen, but we'll hopefully will be on 2022. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Caitlin, how about you?
Sure. My name is Caitlin Morris. I've spent the last 8 years in medical device consulting, both in the US and in global health context. And I started doing some impact investing in global health while running my own consultancy, which got me looking into all the economics of the angel side of things and how investment structures work and all of that. And in January, launched our own startup. So now working on a product in neurocritical care and looking at applying some of the theories I developed on the investing side into how I think about the types of investments we do, and looking to expand access to funding for medical device innovation, and kind of reconsidering some of the ways that we traditionally evaluate what makes for an appropriate model for startups.
Cool, thank you. Scott, how about you?
Sure, yeah. So most of my career I've spent getting health care organizations funding through kind of more traditional grant sources, CMS, NSF, and I've continued to do some of that, but I got intrigued by the angel investing VC side of things and just kind of dipping my toe in the waters, maybe for my own becoming an angel myself, but also looking at clients who've been funding themselves through those more traditional grant sources, and maybe this would be a route for them as well.
Yeah, there's a long conversation that you just whirled around. We'll have to have that another time. Rachel, how about you?
Hi, I'm Rachel. This is my first time in this group. I met John a couple months ago. I am currently the business development director for a small startup biotech company here in Redmond. And I am very interested in health technology. And so this topic that I saw on John's LinkedIn this morning piqued my interest. So I'm here to watch and listen and learn from all of you. So thank you.
Cool, thank you so much. Elizabeth, how about you?
So Bob, John earlier said I was the program manager for APIS, and I am, and excited to be working with people from that perspective. My background is actually in health as a provider. I've also worked with health tech companies, and actually done consulting with Ernst & Young in the health space. But my other thing that I do is I'm an CEO of a small startup looking at reperfusion injury and treatment. And so we have been out there, Scott, going for grants. We have been looking at assuming money from other places. We have looked at what are the struggles that we have as a team, pulling together founders who have full-time jobs at university settings and trying to link them into our sometimes after hours project. And so I understand what it's like to be in most of the situations. I also do a little teaching at the university in regulatory affairs, and I just did one on 510K and what's the best strategy for exiting. So Caitlin, when you were talking about where you want to make a deal and where you want to exit in healthcare, I can resonate with that. So I'm super happy to be organizing these events today, and I was delighted that Julie Anderson, who is the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Cambia Grove, was willing to come and speak to us today. It's so important for us to know who the influencers are in the health system, because it's not easy. All of you have a tiny bit of experience with it in certain streams. We're looking at how we can tie that together to influence adoption. So just before we have Julie start talking, Ken, nice to see you again. I'll wait till you, yep.
Hi, Ken, you're on mute. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Ken Allgood, CEO and founder of HealthFlow.io. Great to join you guys.
Thanks for being here. And Andrea, thanks for joining us. Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, I'm Andrea. I'm the CEO and founder of Awake Labs. We're based in Toronto, Ontario.
Thanks, Andrea, for joining us.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Okay, Julie, I believe we'll turn it to you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to meet with all of you today. So I have a couple of slides that I'm going to walk through. I will hopefully keep it to no more than 10, 15 minutes because I absolutely want the majority of this time to be a dialogue and a discussion. I took notes about everybody's experience and perspective, and I think lots of you will have insights to offer to really round out the story that I'm about to tell from my perspective and my experience. So before I pull up the presentation, I'll just quickly introduce myself and say a little bit about my background so that you know what it is that I bring in terms of that experience and perspective. So I am currently the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Cambia Grove, and I'll say more about Cambia Grove in a moment for those of you who aren't familiar. But I've been in healthcare now for about 15 years. I've worked on many sides of the system. I started out doing consulting, a very specific niche type of revenue cycle consulting for hospitals, before going back and pursuing a master's in public health, specifically focusing on health systems and policy. I focused my graduate research on resource utilization and care coordination and potential policy avenues to help improve coordination across the system. I then went on to do some process improvement work on the hospital side. So specifically doing Lean and Six Sigma process improvement initiatives across, I worked at Stanford Healthcare, and they have a large system there that involves hospitals, cancer center, outpatient care, revenue cycle administration, all of that. And in that role really got a good look at the challenges that are faced boots on the ground, and you know, taking it from the public health systems perspective where I had just been into very nuanced and specific individual workflow processes was a very eye-opening experience for me, which then helped me as I stepped into my next role. I spent about 6 years with a payer, with Blue Shield of California, implementing accountable care organizations and other care coordination models, specifically between us as a payer, medical groups, hospitals, and typically also employer groups that were our customers. That was the role that I filled before joining Cambia Grove about 3 years ago. And a bit about Cambia Grove. So we are a healthcare innovation hub. We focus on advancing innovation and accelerating innovation in healthcare, specifically innovation that we think has the potential to see impact, positive change. And we do this by working to optimize and streamline the ecosystems in which these innovations are attempting to scale. And I'll say more about that in a little bit too, but let me pull up my slides now. One moment. Okay, where's this? And it's fun to see so many of you who have come through Cambia Grove in the past. I'm excited to see you guys again. Welcome you back. Okay, can you see my screen? Perfect. So let's go to, there we go. Okay, so Cambia Grove is a healthcare innovation hub, as I mentioned. We focus on advancing impactful innovation in healthcare, and we do this by optimizing ecosystems. So the way that we used to operate before the pandemic is that we were essentially a coffee shop by day, event space by night type of model, where we offered free and open co-working space to anybody working to improve our healthcare system. And we also had events and programs and resources that were made available both in that space as well as in our virtual environment, online and et cetera. So when the pandemic hit, we obviously had to think about how we could make all of our programming and resources available virtually. And this actually really helped us open our resources available, make them available to a much broader audience. And we now have participation from folks outside of Seattle, outside of Washington. We have people from all over the country and even some international participants in our work. So it's been really fun. We have a really engaged community. And sorry, I'm trying to click through slides. I'm having some trouble. So in 2020, in addition to obviously making everything available virtually, we also launched a totally new way of thinking about healthcare innovation, which we have called the Healthcare Innovation Advancement Framework. And I'll share an overview of this framework because I think it will help frame the conversation about the players. So obviously the topic that I'm diving into today is answering the question of who influences health solution adoption. I think there are answers to the question of what influences health solution adoption that will also factor in here. It's all part of the same story. So we created this framework, the Healthcare Innovation Advancement Framework, to really summarize what we've been hearing from the community over the years. So in interactions that we have with our stakeholders and with the folks who come to our events and engage with us online, what are the themes and what have we been hearing? And this is what we came up with to really help organize our thoughts, help us set goals, and help us understand the best opportunities for our work and for the community at large. So as you can see here, the framework is broken up into three main sections. The first is the triple aim, which is essentially our North Star. It's how we identify the end goal of the work that we're trying to do, which is to achieve impact in improvements in cost, patient experience, and population health. This is a construct that is widely used and well known within the healthcare system, and is why we chose it as our North Star, essentially aligning with Cambia Health Solutions' overall mission, which is to create a healthcare system that is person-focused and economically sustainable. So that's what we're all trying to do. And then the question is, how do we do that? So the second section of this framework is what we call impactful innovation. Essentially, innovation that isn't just for innovation's sake or in an attempt to profit off of a broken system, which we do see a lot. We want to see the type of innovation that has the potential to positively impact the triple aim. And we see these steps and iterations within them as being necessary to do that. So deep problem identification, vetting and shadowing and really deeply understanding the end-to-end processes before scaling and leading to widespread adoption. In order for impactful innovation to succeed, what we've also seen is that there are elements of the greater ecosystem that need to be in place, that need to be essentially optimized to support impactful innovation in its successful widespread adoption. So like you can see here, infrastructure, incentives, and culture are those three elements that we think are really critical to driving the success of the type of innovation that we want to see. And I'll talk about those a little bit more here. So I was brought on to Cambia Grove about 3 years ago to create and launch what we call the Solutions Lab. The Solutions Lab is an initiative that we developed to break down barriers to innovation in healthcare, to really determine what those obstacles are and then figure out the way for us as this innovation hub to help break them down in whatever way makes the most sense. And the approach that we took when we developed this program was to just listen to our community and hear those overlapping themes. You know, what were the hot topics that came up? What did people continue to raise to us as the biggest blocks that they were facing in trying to, you know, make it work in the healthcare system with potentially incredible innovations? And we would dig really deeply into those topics and try to understand the root causes of the issues and build out programmings and make resources available to address what we had heard. And after doing a couple of these cycles, we really started to learn that, well, there were a number of different things that we heard. So we would hear things like, there isn't enough data, we don't have access to data, or nobody will pay for the solution. We can't figure out who's going to actually issue payment, or the system is resistant to change. We can't get in the way of workflows. We can't add another click to the process in the electronic medical record, et cetera. And all of these reasons are often true, and they many of the time exist together all at once. So there are lots of barriers, many times overlapping. We started to realize in digging into these seemingly infinite barriers and challenges that actually what we were hearing was simple. And it all came back to these 3 elements here. In other words, every barrier, every challenge that we learned about and uncovered fell into one of these 3 buckets. So I'll say a little bit more about each of them. So infrastructure includes the resources that are needed to develop solutions, and funding would fall into this category, as well as physical and technical systems to support the solutions. So think data interoperability or lack thereof, and widespread broadband access. Those, you know, really key fundamental infrastructure components. Incentives are those non-financial and financial carrots and sticks that really help to guide and influence behavior. In healthcare, we mostly see these in the way that care is paid for. Are we in a traditional fee-for-service type of environment, or a value-based care model, or something in between? And then finally, you've got culture. Culture focuses on trust, openness to change, and having the cultural competency to create solutions to match the problems that exist in the right way. What we've found is that these elements exist everywhere. So there is always an infrastructure, there are always incentives, and there is always a culture. It's just a matter of creating the right infrastructure, incentives, and culture to support innovation. And our theory is that by doing this, we can support impactful innovation in its effort to achieve the triple aim. So these are the underlying forces. Okay, so I apologize for the teeny tiny text here on this slide. This now gets to the specific players. So who, in terms of who influences the solution adoption. These are the players within the ecosystem, as well as the elements that influence their behavior and interactions. So we define the broader ecosystem as consisting of the 5 points of healthcare, as we've coined the traditional system, and other aligned stakeholders. And I'll talk about each of them, and I'll get into the 5 points specifically a little bit more on the next page. So the 5 points of healthcare ideally puts patients at the center and includes payers, providers, purchasers, and policymakers, the 5 Ps, as we've come to call them. Surrounding the 5 points of healthcare and supporting them as well are numerous critical aligned stakeholders, including startups, vendors, researchers, community-based organizations, professional service providers like consultants, innovation hubs, funders, et cetera. Many players that really help to keep the ecosystem going and improving over time. as well as, of course, as you can see in this visual, the elements of infrastructure, incentives, and culture that really underlay the entirety of the ecosystem and really inform how it functions or doesn't function, depending. Okay, so here we are with specifically the 5 points of healthcare, and I'll say a little bit about this drawing and how we created it in a moment. So we define the traditional healthcare system, as I mentioned before, as consisting of these 5 stakeholder groups. Patients obviously are those individuals who receive healthcare services or interact with the healthcare system to improve their health. Providers, we define as the individuals or organizations responsible for providing care to patients. So this would be doctors, nurses, physician's assistants, hospital and clinic administrators, really anybody or any organization that is responsible for providing that care. Then we have payers down here as the organizations that are responsible for issuing or administering the benefits for a population of patients. So this is what we would think of as insurance companies specifically. Purchasers are defined as the organizations, oopsies, this page, as the organizations responsible for purchasing those health benefits for a population of people. So think about, employers or government entities for those who are not employed. We get a lot of, I think this is probably where there's the most confusion, purchaser and payer, because they sort of do the same thing. They're purchasing things, each of them. We define payers as the one who are actually paying for the care and purchasers as the ones who are paying for the benefits. That's the distinction between those two. And then finally, obviously, we have policy. So we have the elected officials and departments that are responsible for crafting and implementing healthcare policy. So those are the players. We can certainly dive in more to the definitions of them and their inner workings, but I did want to say a little bit about this visual and how we came up with it and the programming that surrounded this concept. So in 2018, to help our community understand the inner workings of the healthcare system, we kicked off our first annual 5 Points Conference. And the goal of this conference was really to answer 2 questions. How was the system designed? And then how does the system actually work? And the program consisted of 6 different events. The first one being with one representative from each point on stage together. And the following 5 were deep dives into each of those individual points. And the visual that you see here is a graphic recording of that first event where we had one representative from each sector on stage together. This happened on my second day with the team. I had just come from my work with Blue Shield of California in the ACO space, and I felt right at home. It was very indicative of the conversations that I had previously. But Maura Little, our executive director, often talks about how during the conversation, she was just shrinking in her chair and just melting because of all of the contentious conversation that was happening and the literal finger pointing that went on stage. And, for me, it just felt very familiar because there is a lot of that in the healthcare system. It's very disjointed. There aren't a lot of connection points aside from those that are transactional. And there is a lot of finger pointing. So during this conversation, we came across a number of learnings, but the main one was that the system isn't really a system. It consists of 5 distinct silos that interact when and if they have to. Some interact better than others, but there's lots of opportunity for connection and improvement. And there is not a lot of alignment on what needs to be done to improve. An example in the conversation was we had a provider who sat on stage and pointed squarely at the payer and said, "You are the problem. We just need to get rid of you and everything would be okay." I think that was the moment when Maura started to sink in her chair. But again, from my perspective, that felt very familiar. I had just come from a payer organization and I had worked for a provider, so I understood both sides of that perspective. Another thing that was interesting about this conversation is that we had asked the graphic recording artist to draw the connection points between each of these 5 silos and to really outline how they work together and how they interact. You'll see that there are a number of dotted lines that are starting to form between, they're almost exclusively, I think, contracts and mostly relating to payment. The graphic recording artist approached Maura at the end of the event and said, "I'm so sorry. I know you wanted me to draw the connection points, but they never talked about them." That didn't come up in conversation. It's not to say that the connection points don't exist, because they obviously do, but it wasn't the focus of this dialogue. The dialogue was very, very indicative of the perspectives that players tend to bring from that bigger picture perspective, which was around individual issues and within the silo, what improvements needed to be made, and from that stakeholders' perspective, what should be done. So learned a lot from this. Obviously, we've learned even more over time, which is why I wanted to share a couple key takeaways, not only from the 5 Points conference, but also from the work that we've done since then, since 2018. So again, the healthcare system is not truly a system. It is comprised of 5 distinct silos with interactions, if and when necessary. Second, innovating in healthcare is uniquely complex and challenging, as I'm sure most of you already know. You've probably lived this on various sides, as have I. Something that is incredibly critical is understanding the problems before creating solutions, and not only understanding the problems, but understanding the end-to-end implications and the workflows, the payment processes, the stakeholders that are necessary in the adoption and implementation of the solution in question. There's also a great need for us to work in optimizing the ecosystem itself. So barriers are everywhere. They fall into what we think are 3 pretty clear categories, and there's lots of work to be done in all of those. And as we collectively as a community work to do that, to make those improvements, what I think is really important and will give innovators a leg up is simply understanding what that looks like, and understanding those barriers, and understanding the current state and how to predict those challenges before they arise and build businesses around them. We heard from one of our stakeholders that he was able to actually adjust his business plan during our 5 Points conference to essentially account for some of the learnings about the various stakeholders. And I think that that's just one example, but I think it can be helpful to really just take a step back and think about the larger ecosystem and the various individuals and organizations involved, as thinking through what is the best way to build a business, to build a solution. And then to that point, we've found that it's very helpful to build partnerships with the community, to build partnerships with those stakeholders that are part of that end-to-end process and workflow, and learn from them and hear their perspectives directly, so that you can get upstream of some of the barriers and challenges that you might face down the road. And this is where Cambia Grove is happy to provide that platform and to make available our community of engaged change makers for that reason. We have lots of great people who are Cambia Grove members, who have connected with one another on our Slack platform during our events, et cetera. And we hope that each of you would consider, if you aren't already, getting involved in that way to help answer any questions, obviously, that I can't answer today, or that you have as you move forward in your decision making. So that concludes my presentation component. I would love to hear questions, and I'd love also to hear feedback from those of you who have experience like this already and would like to weigh in on what we've learned and what we've found over time.
Elizabeth, I need to step away for a sec. Could you manage the conversation? And I see that Bob has his hand up.
I can manage the conversation, and Bob, go on ahead.
Hi. So what I did leave out the last 10 years of working at Microsoft. I was in Microsoft Research working in what became the Health Solutions Group. I was doing computational biology, working on genomics, and we were working with lots of different universities where they had data and we had computational power. I've always found our healthcare system inordinately complex, and I got that when I looked at your diagram here with the 5 points of healthcare. And when we were talking to all these people, I heard very similar stories, and there was lots of finger pointing. To the point that when we as Microsoft, when Health Solutions Group was getting started, it was like everyone was afraid of us coming in and trying to do away with them, as if everybody previously had tried to do away with different functions. Frequently not the doctor, but even hospital administrators and other things at every step in the hierarchy. There's lots of finger pointing. Is there any place that really documents sort of what each of these roles are? What in Microsoft terms, they would be personas of, you know, here's an individual and they fulfill this role and they bring this value and they capture, you know, these costs in delivering this value to the whole system. And I can't read a lot of it. I have to admit my eyes are really bad, or the fonts are really small, or some combination of the two. But is there a deeper graph chart view of the players and really why they exist, what value they're bringing to the system? Because definitely, when you hear people talk about, well, you look at the CEOs and the pay of X, and they look at the CEOs of the hospital or the payer system, or, you know, talking to the benefits people at Microsoft, and there's not a lot of understanding of where they deliver value. So this causes a lot of tension. And so I guess my first question is there a better way to get understanding of that role and the value chain, so that we can see where all of these things come and fit together to help either reduce costs, improve value, you know, something there that makes it. And then, even then, you're still going to need the culture aspects, as you've rightly pointed, without having the culture that says change. And optimization usually means removing waste. I did performance program optimization for 20 years at Microsoft, and my best optimization strategies were to get rid of code that was worthless. And that's terrible when you're talking about people. When you're talking about code, it's wonderful. So that's a very long-winded way of asking the question, you know, is there such an information source, and how do we, is it worthwhile to other people think about these things, or am I just way out on left field?
I love where you're going with that. And I've got a number of different ways that I can answer. So the first thing that comes to mind is that I think there's been a lot of analysis about cost drivers in healthcare from different lenses and potentially with different angles. I think we've seen numbers lately that say that the healthcare industry is nearing $4 trillion annually, and that a third of that is waste. So there is an extreme amount of opportunity for improvement, but at the same time, considering that it is such a large part of our country's economy, to your point, removing that waste has implications for individuals and their families, and so it's a big challenge. Something that Cambia Grove is doing right now is we're actually focusing specifically on the incentives bucket of the ecosystem, and we have a summit that's coming up in early June to get into some of what you just asked, Bob, in terms of why is it like this? Why did the system get set up this way? Where are the incentives, and how can we realign them? We want to talk during that summit. We have some great experts that are coming to the table to share their perspectives on the history, the current state, and potential opportunities for how we can move forward. We also are planning to, this hasn't been launched yet or announced officially, but I can share it here that this is something we're thinking about. We're planning on doing a report like that, like what you just described, where we really analyze cost drivers in the system and do apply that 5 points lens. which I think is a slightly different way than how it's normally analyzed. I've seen some really good analysis that comes out of AHIP, where they have a visual, America's Health Insurance Plans, AHIP, where they show a dollar bill and they show the proportion of that dollar bill and where it goes, but through the lens of your premium dollar. So with your premium dollar, where does the money go? What we're trying to do is take a look at it from a broader perspective, not just specifically about premium dollars, but from the entire system, and specifically the 5 points of healthcare. Where is money going, and where is that waste? I have my own personal opinions on that, and from my experience, where some of the waste is and where some of the money goes that could be eliminated. But we obviously want to make sure that our approach is data driven, and that's something that we're planning on doing. So I love the question, and I would love to even remain in touch with you if you'd be open to it as we move forward with our work, to see if it answers the question in the right way. So more to come on that.
One quick follow-up is I heard a lot about the targeting, waste, and the follow-up of where the dollars are going. The key to that is still going to be, where is the value being produced? So it's not just cost, but it's the results and what is the impact. If the assumption is our goal is to impact public health in general and individual health in particular, then waste becomes what's not moving that or making that process more efficient and more effective. And so you've got a metric that cost per healthy day, cost per unhealthy day, whatever the metric is there. Yeah. We still want to, I think it would be great to drive it back to how is it impacting patient. And the problem with that is patients are so variable. So I would encourage us to not fall into the fallacy of averages, to not fall in the fallacy of, $1 here, $1 per patient. Well, there's millions of different types of patients, lots of different things there that we have all sorts of good data aggregation, classification tools, identifying where the big problems are will help us drive out value for those people, where the little problems are that are highly involved in lots of people versus the small number of chronic care people that are very expensive. All that is going to be really important to tease apart. And with that, I'll go back to mute. Sorry.
No, one thing to say about that, and then Caitlin, I saw you come off mute, and I want to hear your question too. That we, at a high level, we know that we spend more on healthcare than other comparable countries, and we have the poorest outcomes. So at the most macro level, we know that the value isn't there. It's to your point though, and I think this is such an important, next step, or sort of double click, is why, what specifically is causing that massive discrepancy? And I think that's a really important question, and one that I haven't seen answered exactly the way that we would want to see it.
Yeah. The one thing I will say on that, and then I have a question for you, but I don't remember which one of it was now, but one of Atul Gawande's books where he was talking about healthcare, he talks about how the majority of our healthcare expenses occur in the first year and last year of life. And that, even just at the very macro level, hearing that really kind of got me thinking, okay, that at least gives us something to start the conversation with, right? And having lived in different countries under different healthcare systems, there's a lot of this that's about culture and all kinds of things that go beyond the healthcare system itself, right? But even just kind of understanding where some of the places are where spending's happening can be a way to get that conversation going. Julie, I wanted to ask you, in the drawing that you showed, I noticed that there was a quote from the patient that said, "For us, but not by us or with us." And I wanted to get your take on, over the last few years, right? So this was 2018. We've, at least in my circle, I've seen a significant shift in terms of the role of the patient in the ecosystem. And I would say that in kind of two major areas, one being in terms of patients taking a more active role in basically moving into the provider space a little bit, right? And the negative part of that would be the WebMD, like Dr. Google, and all of that providers get really frustrated by. But the positive side of that would be a number of people who have been able to identify their diseases or rare diseases that could be similar to theirs through social media and forums and other methods that maybe the average doctor doesn't know. So kind of the patient taking on a more active role instead of just showing up at the doctor and saying, what's wrong, tell me, and we'll go from there. But then also the other kind of macro trend being on the provider purchaser space, right? As we've seen both consumer products, consumer health, where we now see patients paying directly. We see direct primary care where there's a subscription model rather than insurance model for primary care. And then also seeing obviously the larger trends of higher premiums mean that more is actually being paid out of pocket than there was, say, 15 years ago. So how do you see those trends, and kind of, do you think that there's been a difference in terms of how you would identify the 5 Ps in 2018 versus how you'd identify them today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I have so many different threads that I can go through. I think we at Cambia Grove, I'll just say that we even have been thinking about how we engage the patient community differently since 2018. And so I'll start with that, just in terms of how we have been treating it. We found, just even in putting together the panels for our 5 Points conference, that bringing in patient perspectives, bringing in those individual patients was hard. And usually the reason was because if we wanted to call up a payer or provider, obviously providers that were full-time practicing providers is a different story, but administrators or payers, they can come and present their perspective as part of their day job. You know, they're getting paid already, and so they can take an hour or two out of their time and come and spend it with us. Whereas patients, unless you're talking patient advocacy organizations, it's not their day job. You know, they'd have to take time off work, or they'd have to, you know, carve out hours of their day to otherwise share their perspectives with us. So we've flipped the way that we think about it now to be more proactive in working with great organizations out there, like Patient Orator is a great example. They bring in patients to help tell their stories, and others, and we pay patients for their time. So that's one thing that we've done differently. And it's really helped. I'll give an example of something we did a couple months ago. We actually had a hackathon of sorts. It wasn't a traditional hackathon. It was solution development in the broad sense. Didn't have to be a technology solution. And we centered brainstorming around patient perspectives. We brought in one patient for each of the teams, and they were the ones to share their individual stories to really kick off brainstorming how we could better align incentives with health. And we heard from a lot of those patients that they had never been invited to even participate in something like that before, that they often hear that solutions are developed without their perspectives at the table. So, and this was a couple months ago. So it was extremely interesting to see how that one unfold. And we were so lucky to have these incredible patient representatives who really spoke up and could say, no, that doesn't work for me. That doesn't make sense. And so that's something that we're building into our processes. I would say, you know, gosh, another thing that comes to mind with your question is just how fundamentally broken the purchaser employer-based healthcare system is, and how that's been highlighted during the pandemic, where so many folks have lost their employer-provided health insurance, and I think, you know, and when they've needed it most in many cases. So I think our definition of what the system should look like and could look like has potentially changed, but I think unfortunately it's still the same, and there's still so much improvement, room for improvement. But I will say that I think there has been a push at large to bring patients to the table more than before. So to your original point, Caitlin, I do think that there has been a shift. We felt it from our own approaches, but I think I've seen it as well elsewhere.
Yeah, having done a little bit in the impact investing and starting my career in nonprofits, it rings a lot of when we talk about beneficiaries, right? It's even some of the same terminology, right? But there's been this real shift about a decade ago in the NGO world to say, hey, people who are receiving our services should be part of the development process, and a big push to include human-centered design and all of that, right?
Yep.
And I think medical devices for a long time have included that perspective in terms of human factors, if you're talking about the providers themselves and what their experience is, or what the patient benefit is to justify the reimbursement or things like that. But it's still very much the patients in the receiver role, the patients as the recipients, as the beneficiaries. And I'm just starting to see a lot more of patients wanting to be in more of a collaborative, being seen as one of the stakeholders, not just the beneficiary, at the table. And so just interesting to see how those trends continue to develop.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think it's a matter, and Scott, I see your hand up. I'll come to you next. I think it's a matter of finding the right folks and finding the right diversity of perspectives, because I think, you often hear the phrase, the patient perspective, singular, indicating that there is one. And that's obviously entirely false. And I think what happens is we tend to see, when we think about it in that singular sense, it trends towards what's most common, what's quote normative. And so I think that's what we have to be really careful of as we do engage patients. We also had a patient who shared with us during some of our research who said, what would be great is if someone would come to me and just say, does this make sense to you, to a person who's just isn't an expert, doesn't understand workflow, just does this make sense? Asking that question just first and foremost is obviously such an important thing. And I think it's a matter of finding people who are willing and able to provide that feedback, and also making sure that it is representative of the population that will eventually be using it.
Yeah, so the UW, Dr. Bailey had an entire series of guest lectures this last few months that Zoom actually made possible, because they're not all local in the Seattle area, really bringing in patient perspectives on medical device innovation into her master's program. And I helped her find some of those people. And I do think that's something that, as we've all become more comfortable having these conversations virtually, it does allow a little more of that to take place. Yeah. Anyway, I'll let the conversation keep going, but thank you.
Scott, let's come along to your point.
All right. Hey, thanks for doing this, Julie. Very interested. I've known about Cambia Grove for a while, and was sorry to see the coffee shop close down there. So, like, on your 5 Ps, like 2 of them can be the same group, the policy and the payer. I mean, the dog that's wagging things is often CMS, right? They control such a huge amount of payer dollars in the system that often when they make a policy change, like, all the Blues plans follow right along.
Exactly.
So if you want to drive change, this is often one place to look at it, because they have so much power. Well, one of the things that I'm wondering about in the Pacific Northwest is we are seeing some innovation around Medicaid dollars, and folks probably know that states have some discretion around how Medicaid is done state by state. And I'm just wondering what you're seeing with that discretion, how it's being exercised in Oregon, Washington, and PNW in general. And are there opportunities for innovation within that? What's opening up? What's coming down the pike? I see that Washington has decided they're going to do a public policy option, for example. They put that out to bid. What's that looking like as far as an opportunity?
Yeah, those are great questions. So the first answer that comes to mind is that not a lot has come down the pike our direction on any of those areas, except for sort of what we're just hearing through the grapevine, which I think is indicative of the reality, which is that there is so much opportunity for improvement and innovation in these spaces, and yet they're typically not where they're not as commonly, I should say, where innovators will focus. Most of the innovation efforts that we see are focused in commercial insurance for, large purchasers. We hear a lot about stuff that's happening for, Amazon and whatnot. We don't hear as much about opportunities for innovation in Medicaid specifically. We are, kept up to date about what's happening to a certain extent with the public option, for example, in Washington, and what it could mean. I personally think that any steps in directions like that shake things up, and they have positive impact on the system at large, because they sort of force everyone to wake up and realize that change is coming and that we need to think about things differently. So I personally love to see that type of change coming our way. But in terms of what it means, for example, the startup community, the innovator community at large, Medicaid is not at top of mind for most of the folks that we talk to. And we think that that's a problem. We would like to, for getting back to the ecosystem elements, figure out how we can align incentives and optimize the infrastructure to support and obviously develop the culture that it leans in the direction of supporting Medicaid populations, because that's not something that comes up a lot, and that's a problem. So yeah, that's my honest answer to the question, and I think there's opportunity there.
So I'm going to jump back in here for a second, in that I hadn't given the policy comment there enough thought about payer policies and other policies below the government and regulatory policies, because the regulatory policies still set the framework. Am I correct, or how much latitude does everybody have underneath that? I mean, and I realize now that, yes, you were talking about the states actually operate the local Medicare and the local ones. So the government sets up something, but it was the national government policy after World War II that got us to where healthcare was a benefit, because they made it so attractive to companies to provide it that way, because they were taxing on the pay and the benefits were going untaxed. So they basically made it a no-brainer for a company to provide benefits at that point in time. And that started down this whole path where the consumer or the patient really lost control of how their healthcare was administered and anything to do with them, because they no longer had the economic power. And the other problem we've got now is that we've got very, very, very wealthy organizations that are able to lobby for whatever they want, whether they be payers, whether they be providers, whether they be whatever. So the economic power is just completely dwarfed from the consumer point of view. I'm getting way out of left field now, but I mean, is that in your thought process as well? I mean, how do you really frame policy? And I think this is the problem we have with the United States in general. We have really poor policy in lots of ways, because we don't think very far ahead, and we don't understand unintended side effects, unintended consequences. And then once we see them, we, as the United States, tend to shy away from actually admitting a mistake and moving forward. Our political system says, no, you've made a mistake, or it's not really a mistake, or. And I'm really being very utopian here. Sorry, it's what I do way too poorly. Is there some way that you guys are thinking about this, that as we're looking at policy activities, is there some engagement that you guys have going on, or is that really left to other people and your focus is on developing micro innovation rather than policy innovation?
That's a great question. A couple thoughts come to mind, and I'll answer the question first, which is that the way that Cambia Grove is approaching it is through the ecosystem perspective. So thinking about, we specifically focus on infrastructure, incentives, and culture, and how we can best optimize those. And if the answer is through policy, then we will happily lean in that direction. If the best lever to pull is policy to better align incentives or to better promote data interoperability, for example, there's a lot happening in that space right now, then absolutely yes. The way in which that policy takes shape, we don't have as much interest in seeing in one direction or the other, as long as it's moving in the direction of optimization, how we define it. And so we will highlight those policy initiatives that are getting us in that direction. So for example, you've probably seen a lot of stuff coming out lately about data blocking, information blocking through the 21st Century Cures Act specifically. And so there's work happening at the federal level to unlock data and to allow that data interoperability that we think is so critical to the success of innovation. Obviously within that, to your point, there are downstream impacts and issues that will arise that we probably hadn't thought of before collectively, but we support that type of activity because it moves in the direction of the type of ecosystem that we think is necessary. So that's how we think about policy, as just one way to help us get to this optimized ecosystem. Another quick thought that comes to mind as you were talking is that I think the healthcare system has a tendency to morph in accordance with the policies that are set forth in a way that works best for the healthcare system. It's flexible and it molds. It's obviously also very rigid, but it figures out ways to work within the policies that are put in place. What I mean by that is you think about, here's an example. So HIPAA was obviously put in place to protect patients, I think, and their information. And I think that there is a tendency to point to HIPAA as the reason why things can't be done. You know, oh, it's because of HIPAA that I can't share data, or it's because of HIPAA that this can't happen or that can't happen. And in many cases, absolutely, yes. Like we all want our patient information to be protected, but policies can be leveraged and looked at that way to support the underlying goals. I've seen examples of that. So I think it's really important to your point, put policies in place that make sense and that we get ahead of and think about those potential downstream impacts and the ways in which policies will be leveraged and referenced over time, and the impact they can have on how the system gets set up. Oh, I think you're muted.
I'll stop. I'll unmute. I'm so bad. My one follow-up comment on that is you made a comment that the system will adjust and optimize for the system. I think that's generous. I think that the individuals in the system will optimize for themselves. And we see that everywhere, especially in capitalist societies, where it is, if you're playing in a zero-sum game especially, which is why I like investing, because it's not zero-sum game. You can create and generate new wealth. Where you've got a fixed bowl of money and people are fighting for that same bowl of money, I'm going to optimize for my piece of that pie. I've gone from bowls to pies, but whatever it is. And so that's where you really need to be careful when you have incentives and you have policy. You need to game out A and B and C and what their interactions are going to be. And is it really going in the right direction, or how do you craft the regulations underneath the policy to make sure that you don't have these unintended consequences. And my last comment, sorry, and that is, since this is an investing discussion, with all of this information, do you have a wonderful framework for us to use to evaluate new companies to say, yes, this is a great company to invest in? And
that is
John, thank you for the smile.
That's a great question. And that's another thing that we're actually working on right now. So we have something to start looking at that doesn't answer your question, but it's a starting point to get us to an answer to your question, is Cambia Grove's Impactful Innovation Exchange, which once I have a chance to add some of these links to the chat, I will. The Impactful Innovation Exchange is essentially an inventory of innovations that seek to positively impact the triple aim. So that's what we've got to at this point, are companies that are marching towards the same end goal that we see as critical. We have a list of questions that we've asked these companies to answer to help hopefully point in the direction of whether they are the right company for you. But we haven't yet created that stamp of approval. And that is something that we're working on right now, a certification program of sorts where we will have a committee of third party. Cambia Grove won't be the ones. We personally won't be the ones choosing or certifying the companies themselves, but we'll bring together stakeholders from across the country who can help do that. We're thinking about modeling it after LEED certification. So rather than having it be just a yes, no, we're thinking about having it be in sort of a bronze, silver, gold, platinum, where we can have a rubric that indicates whether or not certain criteria have been met. One thing that we hear all the time when we talk about barriers to innovation is essentially what you just described, Bob, where folks are inundated by potential ideas, and in there are the great ones. They're in there, but there are so many, and it's so hard to know which ones to move forward with and why they should be considered. So that is something that we've had on our roadmap for some time. We are getting closer to launching, and we're really excited about that because we know how potentially helpful that could be to investors, potential customers, and also we think to innovators themselves in understanding, where they potentially fall in that scale. So great question.
That'll be interesting, Julie, because I've been through the innovation exchange companies, and Sarah has put the link up for you, and she's also been through it as well. There's quite a spectrum from service providers to innovators and so I think you might find quite a challenge in being able to decide, are people on there so that they can postulate an idea and then someone can say, hey, I'd like to work with you, and then we could carry this idea forward in a slightly different direction or help someone pivot. And others who are there to say, we've got this worked out and you should come and use us as a solution. And so I'll be really interested and look forward to that. I was super excited to see it. And when you go down through the companies, there's some great ideas.
Yeah. And one thing I will say is that you can filter in the tool for the phase. So there are those companies, to your point, that are there just because they've seen a problem and they want to talk about the problem. We have it actually broken up by the phases in that impactful innovation process I outlined at the beginning. So you'll be able to find solutions that are either just early stage problem identification, all the way through those that have a proven impact and data to show to support the success that they've seen.
I think that for some.
Julie, I was going to say, if it's helpful, there's been a lot of work on this in the impact investing space and trying to create similar rubrics. And so I'd be happy to make some of those introductions if that would be helpful.
Oh, that would be fantastic, Caitlin. Thank you. I think I heard someone else speaking. Is that Alicia?
So I wonder, I see Sarah's hand up. Maybe that would be good. And then I have a question in the chat.
I just had a question for the angel investors and just what you've seen as far as being pitched to you, and if this impacts, impactful innovation discussion has been used as part of their pitch, or if that has been missing. And also, what would you like to see? Because there are different ways to do the pitching, and I think being in a accelerator and learning about how the pitch goes, I also am confused where you're going to find the impact information.
So let me lean into that question a little bit. I resist, when I do the Seattle Angel Conference, handing out a checklist for companies to the investors, because each company is uniquely different with uniquely different odd-shaped cancerous edges. And our goal is to find what the edges look like, and then to understand the team's perspective on that cancerous edge, and then understand their response so that when whatever the problem is on the edge that's going to kill them, that they have a plan or they have a contingency of some kind And it's about the team and their ability to negotiate skiing downhill blindfolded through a forest. And so most of the time, the companies die because there's something in the ecosystem that is a big hairy tree that they run into face first, which they couldn't do anything about because it sprouted overnight and killed them, right? So the noise in the startup system is bigger than the best prepared startup. The startups that succeed because they're just extraordinarily lucky not to have hit a tree when they were not paying attention, right? And the ones that are paying attention try to ski where the trees are not. And so when you have some notion in the changing environment of all of this about what you're going to do if something happens, then that's probably about as good as we can get. However, no, for the most part, people are not saying, look at my lovely checklist of how I've been through this thing and it has done things. They're usually trying to talk about themselves, about what they're doing. But you know that you do what it wants efficiently. You can't you have a team that can't play well, and so they kill themselves by arguing or pissing around on things they shouldn't be doing. They never talk to customers, so they don't know how to get paid by the market in a way that's useful. They can't execute on the deliverables because they don't have an execution strategy and they have no financial discipline. So if you can address those 5 things.
Last year, so reinforce strategy, data intelligence, and then switch them. And then they'll rotation. So that's
somebody there. Sorry. I just muted someone because I think they're in a different conversation. Anyway, so those 5 things ought to be managed, addressed in the pitch, but not as the direct question, right? You should go through the lean canvas and answer all 12 questions in the lean canvas. And if you do that right, it proves that you have fiscal discipline. You should tell us about the team. And if you do that right, you demonstrate that the team can overcome unknown obstacles because they have done it before. If you tell us about the channels in the lean canvas and the go-to-market strategy and the size of the market, it should prove to us that you've done your engagement around customer demand. So this all falls out in a normal way. And what I'm confused by is why there are essentially 15 things I just named, why those 15 things are not like fundamentally framed in every accelerator, that everybody has it as sort of the ABCs of what's going on. And then the angel investors don't really care about that. They just want to know that it's dealt with. And then what they want to really care about is, where are the other risks that are out there that are weird that we should be paying attention to? But if you can't, like put the wheels on the car at all, you shouldn't get out of the accelerator. Sorry, I'm starting to rant.
But it was a good rant.
Sarah, you are dealing with, you put in a link what your company is trying to achieve. Do you want to give us a little description of what you're wanting to do?
Well, I don't want it to be, I'm a employee of them, but also it's like 5 people. But I also just wanted to mention, I also came from Prime Health, which is as a program manager, which is similar kind of community builder as Cambia Grove in Denver. And we focus on the safety net and Medicaid space. So, I can see where the innovation goes because we worked very heavily with, the entities that are involved in the ecosystem. But as part of this the Care on Location company, we have 90% Medicaid patients, just because really that's all we've marketed to, and been trying to work with the policy, with healthcare policy and finance to develop
where we sit, because yes, they're very worried about telemedicine being abused from the larger entities that can kind of manage and lobby and work around all of those unique policy changes that they now can then provide care through. So I do think, you know, if for innovation to be in the space as far as Medicaid goes in particular, and you're going to actually provide impact that's sustainable, you do need to be involved in the policy. And they beg you to be involved in the policy, honestly, because if it's innovation, they certainly don't know what they're doing either, and they fully admit it. But they're also trying to combat the other players that are going to take advantage of the money that they want to actually share with all the members and make sure that they are sustainable at the end so they can still continue to pay for care. So that was my experience. It's telemedicine for just like patients that are Medicaid that maybe don't have access to their primary care. They don't have an established primary care. And we do mainly urgent care / like primary care, urgent care, and definitely more care navigation. We tell them who their primary care provider is attributed to, and also have some psychiatry available that it normally isn't. And we're starting to actually, we have a gender affirming care provider now that can also help in those rural spaces that can't reach Denver. So just trying to find gaps that you can make small, like fill with small solutions, but impactful solutions. But again, we're not like rich. It is completely mission driven. So yeah, so that's what I've experienced, but it's extremely rewarding. And I do think investors are not as interested in us, but again, I think also impactful innovation is maybe less interested in becoming invested in because it may interfere with their mission too. So that's one thing I've come across with my CEO.
So John, you just posted mission driven with margin is magical. And I think a lot of people on this call would agree with that. But to Sarah's point, going out and talking with kind of the broad range of investors, if you don't know kind of where they stand on that spectrum, you either get, oh, you're a social impact, go talk to impact investors. And you're like, you haven't gotten to the part where there's 85% profit margin here. Or you go and talk to the impact investors and it's, well, this should be paid for in the for-profit system, go talk to traditional investors. And so I think one of the challenges that a lot of healthcare companies have when they're having those conversations is in what way to bring up the missional impact, or in what way to bring up how they fit into benefiting the larger ecosystem, given how each audience is going to take that, and how sometimes people aren't so public with their stances on those things coming into it.
Yeah, so everybody has different opinions on how the world works. And clearly we have the philanthropic biased people that use one particular set of wrenches, and we have the capitalist people who have another set of hammers, and then they can't even understand the vocabulary of the other one at all, because the hammers don't matter because everything I touch is a wrench. And so understanding that, I think in the modern age, every modern age being 2020 and beyond, is that everything has a mission, and if it doesn't have a impactful mission and you're not tracking it, then you're about to kill your company. That's my belief about, we've sort of crossed the tipping point at this point. The other half of this is that you have to do due diligence on your audience. And if you do due diligence on the audience, you can lead them through the pearl threads of what you want to say in a way that aligns with what they need to know. And if you do the core process of blather, 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 give me money, the answer is no in both cases. So it's an art of crafting to the audience and doing the due diligence up front. There are clearly investors that care about mission. There are clearly nonprofits that don't understand what profit means.
One thing that I would like to add is that, and my brain went to a different place as you said your last statement, John, but in response to what you were saying before, is that part of what Cambia Grove hopes to achieve by, through optimizing these incentives or optimizing the ecosystem, specifically the incentives piece of it, is that we can bring those two things together, where impact lends itself to the more capitalistic minded individual, where it really honestly can be both at the same time. And because I think what you've said is absolutely right. And what we're trying to achieve is to bridge that gap and make it be just one and the same, ideally.
Certainly where you're a nonprofit and you end up with profit that allows you to better fulfill your mission, that's an ideal space to be, isn't it?
Exactly. I think John might have frozen.
Yes, it looks like he might have. Sarah, one of the things you might do is actually, when you were describing your product a little bit more, I talked to Yang, and maybe there might be some connection there. So Yang, if you can actually put your LinkedIn profile in here, maybe Sarah can get connected with you.
Yeah, will do.
In general, if you post your LinkedIn into the chat, yeah, it'll help people find you and make it go.
Yeah, and if you don't feel like announcing what you're working on, if you put it near your LinkedIn, then people will know how to get connected with you.
John, you posted a question earlier about the pre-seed angel landscape. Do we want to go there?
I think so.
Yeah. So our assumption with the Seattle Angel Conference spinning up the APIS is that there's a meaningful gap right now in the very early stage funding for people who are trying to do some kind of innovation. And so if we think about Bob and his experience, or Elizabeth and her experience around angel investing, what things should those angel investors be thinking about when we're talking about that early stage, pre-seed to pre-seed investment? Are there spots that we have blind spots for that we need to understand, or are there opportunities that we need to be paying attention to? That's for you, Julie.
Oh gosh, I'm sorry. Could you say the last part of that one more time?
So when we're thinking about that early stage, not institutional money, not really Alliance of Angels kind of angels, but even smaller, where we're at the very beginning, companies that have just left an accelerator, like maybe Sarah, who's just leaving an accelerator, not really into flow yet. We have angel investors investing in that early pre-seed space.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Are there, the size of the trees in this system seem big, and they seem to move around all by themselves. So are there places we need to pay attention to because we have inherent blind spots as angels, or are there opportunities that we're not seeing that we should be supporting, so that as we put this program together, that we're able to engage in some kind of successful amplification of the early startups in healthcare?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think of the best way to answer the question. So I think at the earliest stage, what we've seen time and time again is that companies and ideas and solutions that sound great and that really honestly do have the potential to be impactful encounter things as they move through the process that were not anticipated. And I think a lot of what that is due to is a lack of understanding of the broader ecosystem, or the nuanced, just the complexity. I one time was asked by, I think it was in my job interview for Cambia Grove, what is the biggest barrier to innovation in healthcare? And I just said the complexity. And so I think obviously having blind spots is understandable. I mean, we all have them. I have many, you know, even though I've worked on many, many sides of the system already. So what I would say in terms of something to keep in mind and think about is just, you don't need to know absolutely every single thing about this crazy healthcare ecosystem. That's not possible. But what is possible is really deeply understanding the problem that you're trying to solve and all of the pieces in that process. And I think being able to speak to them from specifically with the two things in mind, you know, the end user, whoever that's going to be, whether that's an individual patient or if it's going to be a larger system entity like a purchaser or a payer company, knowing who that's going to be and then knowing who's going to pay for it and being able to clearly articulate that and clearly articulate an understanding of the incentive structure in healthcare. So deep understanding of the problem, deep understanding of the true end user and how that does or does not match with the person the person or entity that will be paying for the service. And again, I think firsthand experience with the problem or exposure to the problem or deep interaction with somebody who or somebodies who have experience with the problem is critical. I learned that firsthand from my process improvement work, that you think you know what's going on until you go and actually sit with the people who are doing the work. And then even what those individuals might say was the problem is different than what is actually happening when you're seeing it with your own eyes. So there is so much value in that deep understanding. So I know it's really hard to kind of vet that, but I would say that I can tell a difference when an idea was developed in a vacuum versus when an idea was developed with that experience and with that exposure. So I would try to develop that lens.
So we call that lean startup methodology in my
exactly.
world. And I beat that drum so hard that everybody runs away now.
You got to do it.
Yeah.
The lean startup methodology. Exactly. That's right.
And so I have 90% or 95% of the people that I have beaten with a stick will not actually do the work to do it. And so can you dive the next step down about, okay, so I tell you to go talk to customers, I tell you to go talk to users, you pretend to do it because talking to 3 people is a lot of people, when in fact you probably need to talk to 1,000. And I just simply will not do the customer calls, but I still would like money because I have a problem and I need some money.
Right.
So how does that fit into your world?
Yeah, good question. So it fits into our world through a couple of the programs that we offer. So our Trails competition is one way that we offer direct connections between startups, the winners of the competition, and the healthcare system. And Trails stands for kind of traction and implementation leads to solutions. It was a little bit of a stretch. We wanted it to fit with Trails. But basically the idea there is that we're trying to get that experience and that exposure quickly, so that these aren't just cold calls. It's hard to get people on the phone. We know that that's a challenge too, even getting those connections that are so critical to get that information. So the Trails competition is something that we do every year where we pick a topic and then we assess startups. We call for applications, we assess startups, and then we provide those startups with access to the healthcare system. We've, in the past, done it with one winner and then one healthcare system entity. And this year, we're thinking about it a little differently and bringing a cohort of winners to essentially a tour of the 5 points or something like that. We're still putting the pieces together. But that's something that we've heard from the startup community that is, at times, maybe not more valuable, because nothing's more valuable than funding, but up there on the list of things that are really valuable is funding and connection points. So we lean in the direction of that. That's our angle, is how do we build those connections? How do we build that deep understanding of the problem? And we're thinking now about ways that we can expand the benefit of that to beyond just one company per year. Obviously, we see lots of improvement to make that more accessible. We also have lots of folks who are engaged on our Slack channel, as I mentioned earlier, who are willing to provide feedback and answer questions. We've seen a lot of that happening on our channel, where folks will pose a question and someone will chime in and say, I've done this, I can help you. So we have that happening both on a pretty casual, open-ended basis, as well as through those more structured programs.
Yeah, and Julie, this was actually something that came up. Sarah and I were getting the conversation going a little bit last on the Cambia Grove Slack channel.
Oh, good. That was you guys. I thought
there is this there's this the advice in general when it comes to lean startup, right? So there's two different things associated with that methodology. One is getting an MVP out there as quickly as possible, which everyone tells me I can't do in healthcare. And so we talk through, okay, maybe it's not a revenue generating MVP, but what can we do to have a similar kind of user feedback? But the other question becomes, if you want to go talk to 1,000 consumers about a product, there's a lot of consumers out there to go talk to. If you're trying to talk to 1,000 neurosurgeons, right? Well, that's a third of the neurosurgeons in the US. But then also recognizing that most of those providers are not very accessible. And so then the ones who are accessible are completely overwhelmed with the number of requests and number of things going on, right? And so we talk with a lot of entrepreneurs, and we've solved some of this, but it's definitely an ongoing challenge to say, how do you get those people out there, getting the feedback, getting the input, getting the conversation going early, that really is critical for investors to have that confidence to be willing to write the check. And at the same time, recognizing that a lot of those people are already, the reason they need the innovation is because they're overwhelmed, is because they're overworked, is because they're already in the least capable of having the time to do it. And so I think that is something that we see a lot in early stage companies struggling with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we hear about that all the time. I think that's part of why we're developing our certification program too, is to help answer the question for the healthcare system about which calls to answer. So, because I think that within the healthcare system, an individual provider or the people taking care of patients, they want to do what's right for patients, and they want to improve the patient experience. They want to improve population health. So, and they want to reduce costs, both for, themselves and their patients. And so if we can help to point to those solutions that have the potential to do that, or that seem that they really have that goal in mind, that might help narrow the list for those individuals within the healthcare system who are so inundated with requests. So one thing that we want to do is help streamline that path and bridge that gap. And how do we do that? And what we've heard a lot from the system is having an entity, a trusted, peer-driven entity that sort of helps, narrow the list or filter it down a little bit, provide that stamp of approval could be really helpful. And so we're working on that too, as I mentioned earlier. I think one other point that I would make is that even though, to your point, John, about how it takes time to do this research and to get that intel, it's so much better to do it now rather than later, when you realize that, we've heard stories about people who have made it pretty far down the path of developing a solution only to find out that it was actually illegal. I think in one case it had something to do with HIPAA, which I mentioned earlier. And oh my gosh, what wasted time and energy and passion. And if it could be just funneled in a different direction that really does match the system's needs and have the right impact goals in mind at the same time, then that's what you'd want to zero in on. And just that early research can help with that.
And also kind of recognizing what the baseline expectation already is, right? So we were working with a company who was doing amazing things, but they were the 5% improvement in the product that would have a much bigger impact for patients, but they didn't really understand the 95% that they had to do the same as everyone else already offered, right? So they were only working on kind of their improvement part. And the first time they got surgeons in there, they were then like, well, what about this? And what about this? And why can't, the baseline of what was already on market was the floor, not a separate device. So even just kind of understanding what your competitors do offer that's good, making sure you really understand the nuance of the problem. Often people are not as obsessed about the problem as they are about their particular solution.
Yep. And that's one of the things that we find often is people who fall in love with their solution and can't see the forest for the trees there. And coming back on John's analogy, that there is actually something that may have a tweak might be sufficient as opposed to blowing it all up and restarting it again. Exactly. I think that was very interesting when Lee Huntsman spoke on the innovation talk on Tuesday that Cambria Grove hosted. And Julie, perhaps you'd be able to put the link into a recording of that. It was very insightful. But one of the things he was saying is, how far along, if we say that there's got to be 3 changes to find something in a different way, it does not need to be new. The second was how we do and what we do is maybe changing how we do to what we do. And the third was changes are sometimes hiding in plain sight. If we could only look at them from either a different solution provider for this, or someone who is actually using something in a different industry that might be imported into, we shouldn't be narrowed by our perspective only of what we're seeing.
And I just included the recording to that event. So hopefully you guys can all access that and take a look if you weren't able to attend.
Thanks very much, Julie.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So Sarah, you were talking about Clubhouse, and it's a great way to get intel right now. Lots of physicians are on there and willing to provide some feedback. So the Clubhouse certainly has a wide variety of topics nonstop that you can pop into and be in a curated conversation. Has anyone else had experience with joining that? John, you have?
Yeah, the MedTech on Clubhouse, the MedTech Club.
Yes.
I see everybody shaking their head. There are really a lot of good conversations on there. I don't know, was that because of the audio format? People felt a lot more comfortable sharing. So the problem is I'm spending too much time on Clubhouse right now, which I probably shouldn't be. But
I feel like it's actually giving providers an opportunity to just share with their community. I think they're so often very we are siloed when we're working, and so this is like the multitasking ability to be part of a community where we're not sitting at our computers, we're on our phones, driving to whatever, but we can feel heard. I honestly think that is why I'm on there, or allow other people to feel heard. It's kind of a design thinking experiment in my mind as well, to pose some problems and go deeper. But if you have certain questions, I mean, if you connect with these people on there's a lot of people that are in health innovation already and might be able to provide some feedback if you're looking for, subject matter experts, on a specific investment that you're really interested in, but you just want to do some I don't know, clear double checking, due diligence, MedStarter, Health Innovations is also a really good one. So both of those I tend to follow, and then there's a lot of offshoots, but it's been helpful.
Well, even the AMA has got involved in having a physician portal that you can ask for advice on a startup just to see whether or not you think this is actually, now that's truly from a siloed physician perspective, but it does give you an idea if that's going to be your end user, whether or not this is going to be something that actually would be working. I want to go back to a question about in terms of investment. And one of the things that we wanted to do is to say, there's a lot of opportunities for health innovation, some of which makes sense to further develop along with some startup funding until you can get to the next stage of your decision tree that says, yep, still go in this direction, pivot to a different direction. where are people finding the opportunities to actually move your company along?
Where are people finding the opportunities? So do you mean in terms of making those connections, finding the opportunity to, for example, pilot a solution? Is that what you're thinking, or just in the design of it?
Well, at one point, John asked if there were just studios that seemed to be most helpful. If we think about, for example, in town here, the product creation studio that actually looks at taking in an idea and helping you figure out whether or not this is even going to be feasible, or the engineering innovations in health at UW actually has a program where startup people can get involved and say, I'd like to submit my project for the students, and that deadline is in August, where you could actually get some support for moving a concept along. The same happens with the legal group and a regulatory group. There are these connections that it's helpful to know about. One of the things that we're hoping with APIS is that we can help be a bit of a conduit on some of those connections, and also into the angel investment community, that we can say, these are things that are useful for you to be considering in your pitch, as Sarah asked.
Yeah, so I think in terms of, we also would love to share those types of opportunities with our community. So anything like that, we would love to promote through our channels as well. I think what we offer, and I spoke about it a little bit earlier, was the trails competition, and that is something that we're really trying to, like I said, make more accessible. It used to be, one company. We're trying to make it more of a delegation, more of a cohort, and we really, for that exact purpose, to help these companies who have early stage solutions really get that input from the healthcare system. And I mentioned this before too, but having it be more than just with one entity, having it be with potentially the entirety of the traditional system, because I think that's what really that's the differentiator in the way Cambia Grove goes about it, is that we really try to look at it through that bigger ecosystem lens, where rather than just, potentially the end user or the customer, it's everybody who's involved. It's all of the stakeholders. And that, I think, is different than, an individual or a group that could assess the product, but without that larger perspective of how the different stakeholders work with each other, and where, from an end-to-end process perspective, who picks it up and runs with it, and what happens when it makes it to that other silo. So that's why we wanted to bring all 5 of the 5 points to the table this year for that competition. And so I would highly recommend it as an opportunity to explore. I will say that because we do choose a topic every year, it's a little narrow. This year we're doing behavioral health. Obviously such an important topic, and such a critical time to be focusing on behavioral and mental health. So companies that are focusing in that area are eligible this year.
Well, that's a super important area, and this being Mental Health Month.
Exactly.
You couldn't even be announcing the topic focus at a better time.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. And again, I would just say that it's informal, but we have a great community. And, I think Sarah and Caitlin were good examples of two that were bouncing ideas back and forth. And please join Cambia Grove as a member and try to leverage that really engaged community. I think, we have in choosing to be a Cambia Grove member, you're already self-identifying as somebody who is engaged in innovation and who wants to see improvements to the healthcare system. And so they're all there, and even just coming to our platform and saying, hey, I've got this idea, I'd love to talk about it with somebody, the odds are good that you'll get to talk to somebody. And so I recommend starting there with us, in addition, obviously, to all of the more formal programs, Elizabeth, that you mentioned, that I think all sound great too. It's one of those things where it's try them all, just try them all and try to get as many perspectives and as much insight as possible.
Totally, I believe that that's quite right. And you'll find the ones that give you more value as you're making these decisions. When I first got on to Clubhouse, I said, oh, this is just like my Cambia Grow Slack chat, but people are jumping in person instead. So
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I haven't checked out Clubhouse yet. I'm a laggard when it comes to that one, but I'm curious about it. And I think it could be something that we could explore too for our own community.
Well, when we touch base with our extended community, there's one thing that people are finding is the need to have these dialogues like this where you actually can share expertise. And so we will be, I'm sensitive to our time coming up to the hour. We have recorded this, and we'll be following up with an opportunity for people if there's got questions that they missed and want to come back to that. People put their contact information in the box. So if you want to keep in the conversation, we're going to regroup again in well, this happens every Thursday, but on a health focus, we'll regroup in a month. And our topic then will be further along. One of the other key levers that we know about is reimbursement. And so people say, oh, I need to know a little bit more about who is actually going to pay for this. And we've heard from our startups that that's one of the topics that they'd like to have.
Yep. And with that, I would recommend our summit as well. That's exactly what we'll be getting into. And it's and follow-up events after the summit. Our focus right now is really on incentives. And
well, sorry.
Yeah, and understanding not necessarily who is going to pay for an individual service from a company or from a startup, but just how does the money flow in healthcare? And I think understanding that is at least a helpful backdrop for who, where does reimbursement come from?
We won't do anything that conflicts with that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Julie, your expertise shines through your experience in a variety of payer and assessing the lean development within an organization has all been a real asset. Does anyone have any last questions that they would like to ask Julie or one of the participants before we sign off here?
Julie, what is the biggest resource that Cambia Grove needs more of in all the different types of support you're trying to do? Who do you need more players of?
Purchasers. We need more employer groups. They're hard to get, and they're so important, and they have so much power. And I think that, I have my comments that I made earlier about the employer-based healthcare system as an issue just in general, but as it stands today in the system, they have an incredible purchasing power and they can really drive change. And at the same time, these organizations, like healthcare isn't their job, like Boeing's not here to drive change in the healthcare system. They're here to make airplanes. And yet they have played such a big role in what the healthcare system looks like. So purchasers are very important, and we need more of them, and they have so much power.
And really seeing what happened with Haven failing in some ways, we saw some of those purchasers take a step back, right? If Berkshire Hathaway and Amazon and Chase can't solve it.
Exactly. Well, I think what we've seen is that, they tried to kind of do it themselves. And what they learned is that they encountered what all the rest of us have encountered, which is that it's really hard and it's really complicated. And just doing it yourself requires building another 5 points, basically. So good luck. But I think then what we see is that these purchasers now, if they can't, quote, do it themselves, then what they can do is influence change in the existing system in a really meaningful way that would hopefully have downstream impacts for everyone, not just their employees. So I think that I hope that we see that progress.
It's an interesting thing because part of it is the trusting of the free market, and we could have a whole other hour on that conversation about business and government having multiple levers here and who's pulling them and in what direction. So John's last comment was, do PEOs impact the healthcare choices?
And I'm sorry, I don't know what PEOs stands for.
Professional employee organizations.
Got it.
They put gig workers together.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, no, that's great. I did know that actually. They
Like
could.
TriNet. Yeah.
They could if mobilized. I think that and if the numbers are big enough and the money is enough, because I think the reason that these large purchasers have so much power is because so I'll quickly just tell a personal story. When I worked for Blue Shield of California, where our ACO program even came from was our largest client, CalPERS in California. It had its own business unit. It was so big. They came to us and said, you need to figure it out. The costs are crazy. It's Kaiser's coming in. They're pricing so much more affordably. We don't want to change over to Kaiser. So you guys need to figure it out or else we're going with Kaiser. And then guess what? Blue Shield and all of our provider partners said, okay, looks like we're doing something, and jumped to it. And next thing you know, we've got 30 ACOs all across the state of California over the course of about 8 years. So there's so much potential to do that, but there has to be the weight behind it and the mobilization. And I think that bringing people together who have the same perspective can drive that change, but it just has to have there has to be the tipping point.
I think on that point, we're going to draw it to a close. Thanks so much to everybody for coming. We've really appreciated your participation, your thoughtful comments, and the connections that you've made for going forward. So thank you again, Julie, for your presentation.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. This was fun.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll say goodbye to everyone then. Thanks.
Bye-bye.